Okay, welcome in Falcha. This is Random Thoughts from County Antrim here in my home in Michigan, in County Antrim, Michigan, on June the 13th, 2021. My half hour of historical tidbits and yarns and stories and legends and random thoughts. Today, it's going to be more historical. A few weeks ago, I talked to you about the potato in Ireland in a podcast I entitled The Potato. And I want to move on from that and talk about the potato and the blight and the famine, but not in Ireland, in the rest of Europe. And I'm going to try to show that the crisis in Ireland was in some respects typical of that in Europe, but in other respects quite unique. So I'm going to do this in two sessions, or two segments of the same podcast. This first segment I'm going to entitle The Belgian Potato. I'm sure you've heard of the Belgian waffle. You may not have heard of the Belgian potato until tonight. Now, to briefly summarize, the Irish didn't become dependent on the potato because they liked them. But with the confiscation of their lands, they were pushed onto ever smaller and smaller parcels of land, and the potato was the only crop they could grow in sufficient quantity to feed a family. And because of the high nutritional content of a potato, one can actually live on a potato diet. And when the potato crop failed, as it did in the 1840s, people starved. And while people were starving in Ireland, Ireland continued to export wheat and oats and barley and cattle and sheep and pigs. And it wasn't that Ireland did not have food. It was simply that the food that was grown and raised in Ireland wasn't available to the people who were starving. So what was going on elsewhere in Europe? Looking at this, I realize in a pandemic, we haven't even put away all our Christmas dishes. I'm drinking coffee out of a Christmas cup. All right, so what was going on elsewhere? Now, the features that made the potato attractive or useful in Ireland made it equally attractive everywhere else. The Spanish brought the potato to Europe from South America in the 1500s, and Francis Drake brought it to the British Isles decades later. And it was planted throughout Europe. And remember from a few weeks ago, a potato only needs water and cool nights. And it doesn't need particularly fertile soil. It can be planted on hillsides and a variety of other places. And as a result, it was extensively planted, kind of from northern, if you picture a map of Europe, kind of from northern Spain, going up to the lower portions of Scandinavia, and from that part of Spain to northern Italy, and up through northern and central Europe. It included France and Belgium, Netherlands, the Germanic states, Prussia included, Austria, Poland, Hungary, in Russia. They were extensively planted, the potatoes, and of course in the British Isles. And the Europeans didn't adopt the potato right away. It was a little suspicious. Almost anything foreign or strange is viewed with suspicion. And there were even edicts announced from some of the religious people that the potato was an aphrodisiac. Instead of making that more attractive, it made it less attractive for some. And it was even Frederick the Great of Prussia. He's credited with introducing the potato to Prussia, which he really didn't do. But he did enhance the use, facilitate the use. Because Prussia did face periodic famines, particularly in wartime. And he encouraged and sometimes even mandated the planting of potatoes in the 18th century in order to combat famine. And the potato served the Europeans the same way it served the Irish. Provided a high-yield, high-protein crop, particularly in places where other crops didn't grow well. And it kept people alive. The potato kept people alive. And on the eve of the potato blight, potatoes provided Northern Europeans with about 10% of their calories. And there's pockets in Europe where this percentage was even higher, much, much higher, much like it was in Ireland, where it was the bulk of sustenance, necessary calories for Europeans. This wasn't merely in rural areas, and I'll use the industrial cities of England as an example, because urban workers discovered the ease of growing potatoes in the small patch of land, small parcel of yard they had in their row houses or wherever they happened to live. Nowadays you have a small backyard, you put up a swing set for the kids, or you put up your barbecue pit in the backyard. But in those days, people planted potatoes. With their meager wages, they just could not buy enough food to feed the family, and they could supplement their diet in urban England, Manchester, Birmingham, and other places with a potato patch. So what about the blight caused by Phytophthora infestans, P. infestans? Probably came from the eastern United States and Canada. I think the first reports that I'd seen were from Philadelphia and New York City in 1843. And the first reports in Europe were in Belgium in 1845. And remember that the P. infestans hit Ireland I said the Belgium was 1844, first reports in Belgium. And remember, the first reports, the P. infestans hit Ireland in 1845, the following year. Now, how did it get there? Well, there were shipments of potato seeds. There's a record of a shipment of potato seeds from Philadelphia to Belgium in 1844, and that might have been the source. And also ships doing transatlantic voyages typically carried barrels of potatoes on board, and that was used to feed passengers and the crew. And some of those may have been infected and ended up in Belgium, but it looks like P. infestans first hit the continent in Belgium in 1844. And when it arrived, the effects were immediate and dramatic. Production of potatoes in Belgium fell by 87% in 1845. It was down 71% in the Netherlands. And within a few years, there were similar numbers, similar decline in Prussia and in Sweden and elsewhere. And when and where the blight hit pretty much depended upon which way the wind was blowing. And of course, eventually it blew over the English Channel into England and Scotland, and from there to Ireland. Now, within a few years of the blight in Europe, about 100,000 people in Europe died of starvation. About 40 or 50,000 of those were people who lived in Belgium. And about 40,000 of those were people who lived in Prussia. And another 10,000 in France. And the rest were from the rest of Europe. And those numbers are staggering. 100,000 people in Northern Europe within a few years of the arrival of P. infestans. And those numbers are staggering, except when you compare them to Ireland, where over 1 million people died of starvation. So what was the difference? What's the differences between Ireland and the rest of Europe? Well, one is the rural people in Europe were slightly better off than they were in Ireland. Ireland was the poorest region, the most potato-dependent region in Europe. Rural poor in Europe relied on the potato, but with the exception of certain pockets, they were not totally dependent upon it as they were in Ireland. European governments, like that of Great Britain, were wedded to the notion of laissez-faire economics, They were convinced the market would take care of food shortages given time. So most governments resorted to things like creating National Day of Prayer and so forth in order to combat the famine. But there were some relief efforts, mainly by churches and private organizations. And the infrastructure was better in the continent of Europe than in Ireland, so that relief could get to the poor easier than in Ireland. And there were also some government-financed public works projects. But the biggest difference between Europe and Ireland was the effort to provide food other than the potato, to the people who were starving. And for example, in the Netherlands, 1845, they withdrew all import duties on food products, food commodities. So there's no tax on any food brought into the country. Other nations took similar efforts to encourage the importing of food into the country when the potato crop failed. Countries eliminated taxes on things like the milling of grains. Some imposed price controls on the sale of bread and other foods, so that in the face of shortage, the prices of everything else wouldn't get beyond the reach of people who were trying to buy food, since they could not eat the potato. Some countries put in credit programs where they could encourage the purchase and the transportation of food. And the other big difference is whenever and wherever the blight hit Europe, one of the first things done by the country affected was to close the country's ports to the export of food. Countries did not permit export of food while people within the country were starving. And these bans on exports were enforced by the military. Armed soldiers prevented the export of food from the European countries that were affected by the potato blight. As you recall, this was not the case in Ireland. Food continued to be exported from Ireland in the midst of the worst years of the potato blight. And to make sure this was the case, armed British troops, guarded the transportation of food from carts at farms all the way to the port cities. Armed British soldiers prevented anyone from interfering with the export of food from Ireland. Exact opposite of what was being done elsewhere in Europe. And again, remember the numbers. Over 1 million people starved in Ireland, and 100,000, dramatic and as catastrophic as that number is, about 100,000 in the rest of Europe, facing the exact same potato blight. Now, the potato blight in Europe did have some ramifications. Led to increased immigration to the United States and Canada, migration within Europe, mainly rural to urban, with people looking for food and for any sustenance whatsoever. It was also a factor in the revolutions of 1848. I don't know if you remember that year from studying history. But there were a series of revolutions in Europe in 1848, and they were uncoordinated efforts. It wasn't a single revolution, but it was spontaneous uprisings in various places. And there were widespread dissatisfaction with the leadership of European nations. You remember, Europe at the time was still governed by kings and queens and the nobility. And for the middle class, there was this long-standing struggle. And the middle class included artisans and merchants, but long-standing struggle to get more participation and more democracy within their nation. And the urban poor, urban working class, who were working for mere pittance, long hours, difficult work, no money. Also were pushing for meaningful wages and better living conditions. And then the potato blight came along. And it wasn't the potato blight wasn't the cause of these revolutions, but it may have been the straw that broke the camel's back, to use a trite expression. Because the potato blight triggered this mass starvation and mass migration and civil unrest. So revolutions blew up all over Europe. And they were thoroughly crushed by the governments and the local military. But they did lead to a number of reforms, and they had great impact, or at least short-term impact, in France and the Germanic states, and in Austria and Denmark, in the Netherlands. It did lead, for example, in France, it led to universal suffrage, at least for men in France. And they established assemblies to write a constitution. They did that in Berlin and Vienna and Frankfurt. Austria abolished serfdom. That was the system kind of one step above slavery, in which peasants were bound to the land. They could not leave the land they were born to. They had to work that land, and their children had to work that land for ever and ever. Now, some of those reforms were short-lived, others more lasting. But overall, I guess you could call the revolutions of 1848 failures, although they did lead to some changes in Europe. And contrast this again with Ireland, because nothing changed in Ireland after the famine. The political and economic system in Ireland was exactly the same before the potato blight and after the potato blight. And the only thing that changed as a result was that between the starvation and the immigration, there were a lot less Irish in Ireland. So that's the contrast between Ireland and the situation elsewhere in Europe in the segment I called the Belgian Potato. So now I'm going to move on to a different but somewhat related topic. And that is Scotland and the Highland Clearances. And if you understand the Highland Clearances, you will understand why there are so many Scottish Americans and Scottish Canadians. Now, go back a little further just to get the context for this. The Celts of Ireland, Scotland, and Celts all over the world really didn't have a concept of land ownership, and certainly no concept of rent. To the extent land was owned, it was owned by the clan. Now, there were rules and requirements, of course, for occupying land, and some of these were in the Celtic Brian law, administered by clan chiefs, etc. And all of this changed, though, in Ireland when the English confiscated the land and transferred ownership to English landlords. And with that, the Irish became tenants, forced to pay rent to occupy what once was their own land. Things evolved a little differently to the Highlanders of Scotland, because Scottish nobles were granted title to land, either by the Scottish king or by the English king, the old feudal system. And initially, even though Scottish nobles were the legal owners, they operated things much like they did in the old Celtic system, which meant they may have a legal title, but they operated the land as like they did when they were clan chiefs, for the benefit of the people in the clans. But this evolved after generations, even centuries. The attitudes evolved. And a noble who owned the land felt entitled to rent. And the members of the clan who lived on the land were obligated to pay rent. So the relationship changed from clan chief and clan member to landlord and tenant. And this ultimately led to the Highland Clearances. This is about a 100-year process from 1750 on, by which tenants were evicted. Highland tenants were evicted from the land and replaced largely with sheep. And it came about because landlords realized that they could make more money with their land by raising sheep and perhaps cattle than they could by collecting rent from Scottish tenants. So the first wave of the clearances, actually three waves, the first wave of the Highland Clearances started around 1750 and lasted for 6 or plus decades after that. And it was done solely for the purposes of increasing income for the landlords. Tenants on the land were evicted. The landlord set up large cattle or sheep operations on the land. And the evicted tenants really had like three choices. One is they left the Highlands forever, usually for the United States or Canada. Sometimes for the Scottish lowlands or for England, but they left the Highlands forever. Second choice is many of them were moved to what were called crofting communities. These were along the coast or one of the many, many islands off the coast of Scotland. And there they were employed, or they were hoped to be employed in fishing or quarrying or Celt operations. Kelp operations, which were industries along the coast of Scotland at the time. And of course, while living in a crofting community, they still would have to pay rent. And I guess the third choice they had, as many of them chose, to move off of where they were and continue farming in the Highlands, but at a relocated site and with payment of even higher rent. And they were relocated to a site in which the landlord didn't need for his larger cattle or sheep operations. So a great number of Highlanders were removed. They were cleared from the land in that first wave to make way for sheep instead of people. Now, the second wave of the Highland Clearances came in the early 1800s. As population grew, these croft communities became overcrowded, and some of those industries, like the kelp industry, kind of died out. And it was also more difficult for the tenant farmers to sustain themselves with agriculture by this time, which of course led to the same dependency on the potato as the Irish. So in many cases, landlords responded to this with what was called assisted passage. Landlords assisted the Highlanders, paying part of their passage for them to leave Scotland forever. And many did, again, for the United States or Canada. Now, the third wave of the Highland Clearances came when P. infestans arrived in Scotland in 1845, same time it arrived in Europe and in Ireland. And the story of P. infestans in Scotland is similar to that in Ireland. But there are also significant differences. The crofters in the Highlands were as dependent upon the potato for sustenance as were the Irish. And the British response, the official British response to the Blight was the same, which was their slavish devotion to free enterprise meant that the markets will take care of this somehow. We don't need to provide assistance. And when assistance was provided did require checking into the workhouses or getting a job in the public works projects. And export worked exactly as it did in Ireland. The cattle and the sheep raised in the Highlands were shipped south for consumption elsewhere in Great Britain. With the end of the potato in the Highlands, the cattle and sheep were not for eating, they were for exporting. Now, there were some differences between Scotland and Ireland. Private relief got to Ireland, to the Highlands a little quicker, in greater supply than it did to Ireland, and probably for no other reason than Scotland's closer to England. The displaced people of Scotland also had a few options that were not available to the Irish, mainly looking for employment in Edinburgh or Glasgow or other Scottish towns. But the main reason, the number one reason why fewer Scots died of hunger than Irish is that there were fewer Highlanders left in the Highlands to die. When the potato crop failed in Ireland, Irish tenant farmers were starving, and the landlords responded by evicting them. So the starving Irish became starving homeless Irish. And with the Highland Clearances, the Highlanders had already been evicted. Now, the pain of the mass evictions of the Highland Clearances were no difference than the pain of the mass evictions in Ireland. But the Highland Clearances were done decades before the arrival of the potato blight, and the mass evictions of the Irish came after. So it's hard to say how many Highlanders died from the potato famine. There aren't any decent, reliable numbers. But certainly it was in the tens of thousands. And it would be considered one of the British Isles' largest catastrophes had it not been that so many more Irish died in the same time period. So that's my podcast for today. The Belgian Potato and the Highland Clearances, contrasting them both with the Irish experiences of the potato blight. So I think I'll switch to something more uplifting next week. But in the meantime, please take a look at my website, clandonald.net. Send me an email, maybe an uplifting, cheery email at clandonald@gmail.com. Take a look at my Facebook page and like and share it. And like and share this video so that this word gets out, this bit about Irish history, and in this case Scottish and European history, get out to the bigger community. So that's all for now. Thank you.